TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.
Okay, hello and welcome to Green Housing on Housing TV Africa. My name is Ubong Osoro, and this is actually a program where we look at policies concerning climate change and what we can do, how we can impact our society, our environment more favorably, and get to do something about all of the issues we have with mitigation, adaptation, and transition towards climate change. Today on the show, I have somebody who will be helping us make sense of the discussions that we have. Amazing discussion, because we'll be looking at climate denialism and what it means, what are the politics around climate change, and we have an expert that will be helping us make sense on the show. You're welcome to the show. Let's go on a short break, and when we're back, we'll go straight into our discussions. All right, welcome to the show Green Housing, and let's get straight to our discussion. Today, to help us make sense about the climate politics, especially in America, we have Gerald Kutney. Gerald is actually a commentator on the news and social media on the politics of climate change. Gerald also has a PhD in chemistry and was an adjunct professor at the University of Northern British Columbia, where he taught graduate courses on climate change and global warming. He's also ranked among the top 100 global influencers in climate science and forecast, especially on Twitter. And he was also the #1 global influencer for education and public awareness in the climate change debate. Gerald has published books, a lot of books, Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol, and also Climate Denial in American Politics, which we want to talk about today. Hashtag Climate Bro. Gerald, how are you doing? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's start on this note. How did you get into the climate line? How did you start climate advocacy?
That happened for me about 15 years ago. I was my whole career I was working mainly in bioenergy and biofuels. And around the year, 2010 or so, I was frustrated that nothing was really happening. It wasn't happening in Canada. It wasn't happening in America. It wasn't almost happening anywhere. And so I started looking, trying to find the answers why. And it quickly became apparent the problem was no longer the science of climate change. The science of climate change has been solid since the early 1990s. That's when the world came together at Rio. The science was strong enough by the early 1990s that all the nations around the world signed off at the Earth Summit in Rio. But by 2010, hardly anything was happening. And it was clear to me that the problem was no longer climate science. It was the politics of climate science. It was the politics of climate science being so influenced by climate denial. So that's how I got into it.
Amazing. I've seen you, I followed you on Twitter for quite a number of years, and I've actually seen the work you've done concerning, talking about climate denial, bringing out facts daily, and just trying to counter. How strong is climate denial in Canada? I know you stay in Canada, and you wrote a book about the politics in Washington. That's the US. How strong is climate denial in Canada and in the US?
In Canada, there's certainly a significant number of climate deniers. In our political system, we have three major parties, political parties. One of them, the Conservative Party of Canada, is definitely a party of climate denial. But it does not compare to the climate denialism that exists in the United States. No country that I'm aware of has as much political climate denial as the United States does. The Republican Party, it's ingrained in the Republicans that they're climate deniers. If a Republican has tried to push climate change in the past decade pretty well, they were essentially looked upon as a traitor within the party. And in the US, there's only two parties to choose from. And it's very hard to get something done politically by passing legislation when one of only two parties is always against that legislation.
All right, so let's get into your book, Climate Denial in American Politics. Can you lead us through the book? What is the book about, and what are some of the things that you are able to bring to the fore so that people could have a better perspective of these issues?
Well, the book begins with an introduction to what is climate denial. A lot of people aren't really familiar with that term. The easiest definition is that if you deny the major aspects of the science of climate change, it doesn't mean you have to deny all the science, but if you deny any of the major points of the science of climate change, that makes you a climate denier. It even makes you a climate denier if you say, oh, I accept the science of climate change, but I don't think action is necessary. Well, why do I say that? It's because they're denying that science is telling us over and over again, we must be taking action. Our time is running out. And the longer we take, the worse it gets, the more expensive it's going to be, the more lives that will be lost. So after the general introduction to climate change, I go into the strategy of what climate deniers do. The second chapter goes into the coming of climate science into Washington. And there, I really go back to the start of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, just near the end of World War II. It goes into the Cold War. And that's really the science of climate change started to develop. It first showed up, climate change science in Washington, in the late 1950s. So it's been around in Washington already for a long period of time. Right back then, during the administration of Eisenhower, scientists were coming to Washington warning that climate change was coming. And that was fine. We had lots of time to react, but we never reacted. That first chapter ends with the administration of Ronald Reagan. That's when things changed, and they really got messy. Starting with the administration of George H.W. Bush, starting 1989, early 1990s. That's when climate denial in Washington, organized climate denial in Washington, was taking place. It was pushed by a massive public relations propaganda campaign, which I believe is the largest propaganda campaign in history by the energy industrial complex. That includes the big oil, include coal manufacturers, a lot of the energy manufacturers in the US, and other industries that were reliant upon fossil fuels. They put out propaganda pushing lies over and over and over again. And the problem with propaganda when it first starts out, people dismiss it as not being important. But when lies are repeated over and over and over again, and no one is challenging them, people start to believe them. It's just human nature. And so the third chapter follows the climate denial stage from George H.W. Bush until halfway through the Biden era. It goes through the what climate deniers were doing in Washington, and especially on the politicians that are becoming climate deniers. The fourth chapter goes into what I call the denial cabal. By the early 2000s, climate denial was embedded within the Republican Party. The GOP, as it's called, the Grand Old Party, which I call the Grand Oil Party, had climate denial throughout its ranks and was actively aggressive in stopping any legislation on climate change. When George W. Bush had come to power, he used to say a lot of nice things about climate change. Oh, it's important we take action and blah, 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 blah. But this was just greenwashing. He never did anything. He never intended to do anything. And afterwards, each Republican president, which is now highlighted with that of Donald Trump, it shows the insidious nature and how dangerous political climate denier is. I covered one term of President Trump when he was in office. And the book took me a few years to write, came out just over a year ago. But look what has happened even since. It's 10 times worse. He's out not only to destroy American climate legislation, the small amount that existed, he wants to set the whole world on fire with his theme motto of drill, baby, drill. The last chapter, I really focus on the energy industrial complex, which is, again, the big fossil fuel companies and that, because that is where all this has come from. You know, politicians didn't just become climate deniers. Ordinary people did not just become climate deniers. It makes no sense to do that. The science has been crystal clear for decades. And there is no science, none, that has contradicted the accepted science of climate change today. The only reason this happened is the energy industrial complex put profits ahead of people. They put shareholders ahead of society. This is one of the most nefarious, dangerous movements that has ever existed in human history.
All right. Okay, so I see from going through some of the things that you've said, I see that you use direct quotes, you use primary sources, government records to actually show how important this the problem of climate denial is. And I think you're moving us towards another dimension, because instead of saying let's take action, you're looking at it from the source, the political aspect of it. What does it mean, denying it politically? Meaning that if we're able to solve the political problem, we'll have more actions. And I think that's actually a novel thing. That's a new area to look at, because most of the people, most climate advocates just look at, okay, mitigation, adaptation, but you're saying let's look at the politics behind climate change. So take us through the surveys, some of the surveys you did, the analysis, the records, and even the primary sources that you got to use in the book.
The one thing I wanted to focus on was less opinion. You know, I certainly put my opinion here and there in the book, but I want to show that this is not my opinion. This is what US government records document. And so the book focuses on the hearings in Congress in the United States, which are all published online. I must have gone through hundreds of them. Most of them are quite boring, by the way. But I've highlighted the major examples of climate denial, some trying to find the very first time it happened, and then followed the evolution of how it increased over time in Washington. But at the same time, I tried to highlight those that fought back. Because some politicians did try to fight back against climate denial in Washington. The most famous is Al Gore, but there's others that did it as well. And the problem was they were too few. And so while the entire Republican Party, most were very aggressive in not supporting any legislation to stop climate change. The Democrats, a few special people, fought to do something, but there wasn't enough of them. And so that documentation goes right into halfway through what Biden had done. Now, why spend so much time doing that? I wanted to show the insidious nature of this, especially within American politics. I don't see this in a lot of other countries. Climate denial exists in other political parties, and some of them feed off what's happening in America. But there's nothing like what's happened in the US. Now, look at the situation. You're talking about the most powerful economy in the world. You're talking about the most powerful country in the world. You're also talking about the country that has the greatest accumulated carbon dioxide emissions in the world. Anytime someone tries to do something really meaningful against climate change, you have one party, because of climate denial, it's the only reason that they won't even talk about it. It's not that they reject any propositions to move forward. They will not talk about it. How can anything be achieved? So at the end of the book, my conclusion was that climate denial has to stop. No more science is going to help. You know, the IPCC does, for example, a fantastic job at summarizing and analyzing the peer-reviewed literature every 6 or 7 years or so. They just make the argument stronger and stronger. We could be doing IPCC reports for the next 100 years. It's not going to convert to climate deniers. And so you have to crack that. Once you crack that, climate change legislation, almost by definition, has to be bipartisan for it to work. There has been no bipartisan discussions on climate change in the US for almost ever. And so if you can get the Republican parties past it, that they're at least willing to accept the major parts of the science and to honestly sit down, then the normal politics of climate change should happen. Politicians aren't there to judge the science of climate change. They're there to judge how government should react to that science, what legislation should be passed. America never gets to those discussions. It's not allowed because of the Republican Party fighting back. It's okay to fight over the solutions. You know, so if you have committees that look at what to do about climate change, hopefully using documents such as the IPCC as a guide, because they summarize all the mitigation steps that should be taken, all the adaptation steps that should be taken, then they can fight between themselves what they believe is the best way forward. That's what politics should be doing. But again, that cannot happen if the party does not believe there's a problem to begin with. There is no political will in the United States for Republicans to do anything about climate change. In fact, it's worse than that. It's anti-science. It fights to destroy even a hint that this should be done.
All right, Gerald, let's go on a short break. And when we come back, I have some things I want to take you on because even the science of climate change, we have some professors who have actually come out to deny. So what do we do to the academics that deny climate change? Let's go for a short break.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts. On Facebook, Housing TV Africa. On Twitter, Housing TV Africa. Instagram, Housing TV Africa.
All right, if you're just joining us, this is Green Housing on Housing TV Africa. My name is Ubong Usoro, and today we have Gerald Kudney, who is actually a commentator on news and social media on the politics of climate change crisis. He's actually doing something very amazing, looking at something from another perspective, the political sides of it, and saying the political side of it, I beg your pardon, and saying, if we have the political will, we'll be able to get more action. Of course, we know that politics, in a way, controls what we do, and it's very important we have the right political will. So I come to you with a question I asked. We have academics, we have professors, we have learned people, lawyers, economists, all kinds of people deny climate change. So it's not just about the knowledge gap, it's about the will, it's about maybe the politics, like you've said, just the politics, because you get money from the big oils and all of that, the companies. People don't want to go out of jobs. Carbon pricing may make some companies go out of jobs, and people are looking at all of this, say, okay, let's just keep managing somehow, maybe to get better. So how do we tackle the academics and those who should be at the forefront, but they are misleading a lot of people, in quotes?
You remember what I said before? This is no longer an issue about science. If it was, you and I would not be talking today. We would have been tackling climate change, and this issue would be under control. I honestly believe that. If there had been no climate denial, the world was ready to react all the way back in 1992 at the real. All the countries of the world agreed that this was a problem that had to be tackled. And one thing that's very clear to me is a lot of climate deniers, there is not anything wrong with their education.
Yeah.
There is not a problem with their intelligence. For people that react especially to the propaganda, some are much more susceptible than others. And that's related to ideology, especially political ideology. And you can't easily change people's ideology. I myself am much more centralist, maybe more liberal or democratic. There's other people out there that are more Republican, more conservative, and it's fine. That's the way life is. But they are, especially in the Republican Party in the US, they were primed for this propaganda campaign that I mentioned to you before. But just as it applies to politicians, it applies to some academics. It applies to some scientists and other highly professional people that are highly educated. But we have to put this in perspective. If you look, for example, the IPCC reports, which we've mentioned before, which summarizes the literature, the peer-reviewed literature about the science of climate change once or twice a decade, there's tens of thousands of authors that they review in those reports. And you rightly brought up, but wait, there's some academics, a handful. Remember, it's only a handful of climate scientists that are climate deniers. The percentage is trivial. In fact, there's actually a couple of Nobel Prize winners that are climate deniers. They seem to be much greater than normal, because if you look on social media or in the press, the high-profile climate deniers repeat over and over again of what this trivial group of scientists say. The other point to understand is science is not based on opinion. It's not based on my opinion. It's not based on your opinion. It's based on what is in the peer-reviewed literature. Why this is important? Let's say I was really happy and I'm a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And I stand up and I say, well, the science of climate change is wrong. I have a right to my opinion, and I have great influence over people because I have credentials. But all those people, all they're doing, and this is true for the small handful who are truly climate scientists, are giving is their opinion. Science does not care about opinions. These people, none of them have peer-reviewed articles accepted by the greater scientific community that says the science is wrong. So science is not influenced by this trivial group that is anti-science of climate change. The difficult part
All right,
is...
so yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about the support. Let's talk about the support you've gotten. How supportive have professionals and academics and even politicians been to, the book Climate Denial in American Politics? How supportive have you gotten support from people?
Certainly on the website from where the book was published by Routledge in the UK, there's several, for example, leading climate scientists that have given critical reviews for me on the book. There's also a few politicians that have given it. The one difficulty I had is that the book is published in the academic press, which I was very proud of, actually. It's peer-reviewed, but academic press. And so that means a lot of the people are really what I'd like to get the message out to don't get to see it. But that's why I encourage people to get your local library to order it. In many areas of the world, if you have a local library or if you have a university near you and you request it, they will add it to their collection.
Yeah, I went online and saw the price about 30, I think £37. That was what I saw for the book. And I'm going to come to you about that. Let me just mention the content of the book. We have the introduction, we have climate denialism, we have climate science in Washington, we have climate denialism in Washington, we have the denial cabal, and we have the denial machine index. Some of the breakdown to the content of the book. And I've seen that you've done some other work. Are you at the moment, are you lecturing at any university? Because I've seen that you've done some, lecturing at universities at different times.
No, and I'm not. Well, first of all, I'm not a climate scientist. Okay, I don't want people to be misled to think I am. I am not. I had the opportunity to be an adjunct professor briefly at the University of Northern British Columbia. That is only the true position I briefly had. Since then, I'm here in Ottawa, Canada. I've had the opportunity to give more than a half dozen lectures at the two major universities here on climate denial, which is, I really enjoy that. Talking to young people about climate denial. And some of these classes were fairly large. Like there was like hundreds of students in the room. There's climate deniers in that room. There is in any large group like that. And they ask really good questions. So no, I have not had a position on official positions. I've been invited to give a few lectures on climate denial, especially in politics. And generally, I'm retired.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so the US serves as the fulcrum of the world. A lot of people look up to the US for direction, for innovation, for creativity. So how do you think that climate denialism in the US is affecting other countries, particularly in Africa? Have you been to Africa before?
I've been to South Africa a few times. It was a while ago, but that's the only part of the continent I've been to. And I know when I was in South Africa, it was just a beautiful country.
You've not been to Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria.
I have not been to Nigeria, unfortunately.
All right. So what do you think we can talk about it? Because it is amazing that we have politicians, like you've mentioned, in different places now, trying to also go into climate denialism, looking at if the biggest people in the world stage, the leaders from all of these political parties and all of these big nations are denying the signs of climate change. People are looking at it and saying, okay, why not? For instance, in Africa, we don't, Nigeria, our emissions level are very low because the productivity, it's not quite as much as in Canada or in the US. But we keep people tell us, they talk about climate adaptation, greenhousing, and all of these things. And some people in Africa are like, it doesn't concern us, So there's a rippling effect. So what do we do, or how do we pass the message to people here in Africa and in other parts of the world, maybe Asia, maybe other parts of the world that may be struggling with the signs of climate change?
But the disappointing part, by definition, leadership has to come from developed countries. It has to come from the EU, it has to come from the US, and other countries that have the economic ability to tackle it. Leading by example and helping developing countries. And that's why when you have the COP meetings on climate change, it is a responsibility of the developed world to provide funding to help other nations that do not have the economic power to make these major changes. But let's look back a little bit too. A couple of points. As an individual, for you, for me, for any individual, it doesn't matter where you are, what can you do? Well, one thing is that as a person, you should act the best you can. And what I do and what you do and everyone does doesn't matter as long as you think of what can I do to help reduce the emissions that I contribute to. The second point is engage, like we're doing here. Talk about climate change. That's why I do in social media on it all the time. I engage with people. Don't be scared to talk to a climate denier. Some of them can be quite aggressive. A lot of them are almost bullies. But that is also very important. The third point, and this is the most important for an individual, is never, never, never vote for a climate denier. When you look at that bigger picture, I mentioned before, that all this started from that giant propaganda campaign from the energy industrial complex, which continues today, by the way. They've never stopped. We have to fight back, not with propaganda, but with education. What's the difference between education and propaganda? It's an interesting question. The tools are almost the same. In education, you repeat the same statement over and over and over again. That's how you learn. Propaganda does the same thing, but propaganda is pushing lies. Education is pushing the truth. And it's so important that we all fight to make sure at least the truth gets out there. When someone does publish something on climate denial, you follow me on Twitter, now X, it's all I do. I learned the hard way. I don't share science anymore. I used to. I don't bother. Climate deniers don't care about science. They don't care about any of the answers that you give them for their questions. They ask questions to argue. They ask questions to imply that there's a debate. They ask questions to make you look bad because they have gotcha answers when you respond. So what I do and what I recommend is you have to discredit them. You discredit the person who does the climate denial. You discredit their sources. You discredit them personally, because this is a movement that is wrong. The climate denial movement leads to death and destruction. They contribute to the extreme weather events by delaying action, political action on climate change. So this is worth our effort to fight against.
Thank you so much, Gerald Kudney, for talking to us on Housing TV Africa. We're so excited to have this conversation with you. Gerald is actually the author of the book Climate Denial in American Politics, #ClimateBro. He's also the writer of the book Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol. Thank you so much, Gerald, for coming on the show. We really do appreciate your time, and we hope that all of the work you do brings out positive change at the end of the day. And also, by the way, we hope that one of these days you are able to visit Nigeria. Nigeria, we have the biggest population in Africa, and it's actually a beautiful place. Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, so many places that you may want to visit. Thank you so much, Gerald, for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and all the best to you and your viewers. Have a good one, my friend.
You too, my brother. Thank you.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.